like the home economy, the traditional workplace persisted into the 19th century. The Industrial Revolution took over a century to actually transform work across industries. So if we can start just at the beginning in the 1800 and look at the relationship between population and agriculture and the agricultural workforce, we can see that even in 1800, in most countries, 60% of the workforce was directly engaged in agricultural production. Poland, 9 million people, Italy, 18 million people, France, 30 million people, right? So when you do the percentages of the total population, which is in millions right here, and you look at 60% of those, and you put that in context to the rest of Europe, as in Southern Europe and in Eastern Europe, agriculture remained the primary activity for most people on the continent. Only in smaller countries and Western countries, so in the Netherlands and in England, with much smaller populations, right? Netherlands has 2, England 8.2. These countries were, during the course of the 18th century, were able to decrease the amount of people working. By the 18th century, we were able to decrease the amount of people working in agriculture, but they're still up in the 40 or 30% of the entire workforce. So if you look at the chart, you'll see that between 1500 and 1800, there were some advances in agriculture. Agricultural productivity did increase during the early modern period, but the big changes happen after 1800, and they don't happen uniformly across Europe. They have the greatest gains in France, the Netherlands, and England, and Italy. But Poland, using Poland as an example of Eastern Europe persisted well into the 19th century with 40% of its workforce in agriculture, whereas the rest of Europe, right, Western Europe, was doing much better in terms of changing the nature of its workplace. So we have to keep this in mind when we talk about the Industrial Revolution, when we talk about all the other aspects going forward, that the majority of people living in Europe still engaged in traditional activities, agriculture being the primary activity. It's not until you get to the 20th century when you see the agricultural workforce drop off the chart so that it becomes a minute part of European life. If we then go back and look at agricultural production, what was that about? Well, in the South and in the mountains, they were the poorest regions of the continent. Why? Because they had poor soil. If you have poor soil, you're going to have lower productivity. The soil around the Mediterranean is very shallow because it's very rocky. And then obviously when you get into the mountains, they have the climate is different. The amount of rocks and terrain, they don't have the wide open spaces you need to really ramp up agricultural productivity. They used a 2-field crop rotation, which means that every year 50% of the crop land had to lay fallow. So right off the bat, you're taking land out of productivity because it has to revitalize itself just naturally by not being used. In the South and in the mountains, they're still using open field systems where the entire village works a field together. They don't have individual land ownership. It is communal work. And by and large, there's less of an incentive for any individual to work better or more efficiently than others. There's not a lot of drive for innovation because no one individual is getting the benefit of the excess. On the other hand, when you look at the north and go west, they have deeper, richer soil. That deeper, richer soil is more productive. They were able to move quickly between after in the Middle Ages, in the early modern period, to a 3-field crop rotation system. So instead of having half the field lay fallow, they were able to reduce that to only 1/3 of the field was laying fallow at any time. That brought into productivity land that otherwise would just be sitting there. In the 1600s and the 1700s, both the Netherlands and England started enclosure, which means that governments pushed peasants off land. Enclosure allowed a single landowner to fence off a field and restrict workers to laborers. So these landowners would then hire laborers, and they were looking for efficiency, and they only wanted to pay the people that were going to give the most bang for the buck when the crop was sold. And so this forced peasants out of agricultural productivity and dropped the percentage of people working the land. That's why if you go back to if you rewind a little bit, you'll see that the percentage of workforce was already dropping in England and the Netherlands because of these legal avenues available to property owners that were not available in France or in Eastern Europe. They still engaged in communal activities. Productivity, by and large, in terms of what products are produced, can be seen in consumption. So, for example, this is a beer wine chart. This one is a wine chart that shows wine consumption, and you see that people consume more wine in the south of Europe than in the north of Europe. That's very simple. That grapes grow better in warmer climates, and that's the Mediterranean, all the way up to about the Rhine River. After you go above the Rhine River, grape production begins to fall off, and so there's not as much wine consumption. It was very difficult to transport bulk goods like wine. It's heavy, it's expensive, and so most people consumed what they could grow locally. This creates cultural habits that last all the way, as for example, this map shows from 2010. But if you go back into the 1800s, you go back into the 19th century, you get the same idea. Or if you look at beer consumption, right? Beer consumption happens north and east of the Rhine River. There's more beer consumed in Germany, in Austria, in Czechoslovakia, in Poland, because those areas, right, in the north are able to grow wheat fields and wheat and hops and things that are necessary to go into beer. This makes, once again, a difference in consumption. They're going to want alcohol, but they're not going to import wine. They're going to drink whatever they can produce locally. And so what grows locally are wheat and hops crops, and those are turned into alcohol. They're not going to drink a lot of wine. Now, if you're wealthy, right, if on one side of this divide and the other, you can import it in, but it creates habits that last for generations. And this map goes all the way up to 2011, and you still don't get a lot of wine drinkers in Germany. It's harder to find a a beer in Southern Europe than it is to find wine. The expenses are changing. The agricultural workforce. In Eastern Europe, they're still relying on serfdom, that the peasant was tied to the land. Not until you get to mid-century does the Russian monarch do something about serfdom, and we're going to talk about that later. But at this period, beginning of the century, millions of people could not move. They had no freedom of movement. They were tied to wherever they had been born. Moving westward from there, peasants worked either as tenant farmers or sharecroppers. Tenant farmers mean that they had to pay a cash rent. Sharecroppers, they played part in kind. As the 19th century persisted, right, more and more European peasants had to pay cash rather than sharecropping. Sharecropping was a medieval way of land usage. In the 16th and 17th and 18th centuries, that goes out of favor in favor of a cash relationship between the peasant who works the land and the landowner. More and more landowners wanted cash instead of crops. The final way of looking at the workforce was the Western independent farmer, what the English call the yeoman farmer, where the person who worked the land actually owned the land. This was rare. With the yeoman farmer, they had to be able to enclose, right? That they were able to push everybody else off the land, all the other people in the community that they had with them. They were the only ones who were going to work it. And if they got wealthy enough, they could then hire laborers to help them, right? A plowman to plow the field, or a farmhand to help harvest. And the wealthiest of these independent farmers, right? They had no noble title. They had no social status in terms of service to the king, but they could become incredibly wealthy. And the goal was that they would sit back and only have farm laborers. But they had really no responsibility to them besides providing them with a wage or a cottage or some other means where they could survive through agricultural labor. But if they no longer became productive, they could be disposed of, right? They could just, they could be fired, they could be pushed off the land, they could be just dismissed. Whereas in Eastern Europe, with the serfs couldn't be dismissed, no matter how fast or slow they worked. They were there, they were stuck for life. The pace of work in agricultural activities, most of this is seasonal. Depending upon whether it's hot or cold, there's a time to plant, there's a time to harvest, there's a time to reap, there's a time to sow. And so in the springtime, that was a very active period in which the work had to be done for plowing and sowing. During the intermediate period, during the summer period, there's a down period because not much to do. You're almost literally watching grass grow a lot of times, so you have to maybe move rocks, move dirt, move things that you're going to do some of the bigger projects that are long-term, but it's not directly engaged in this. In the autumn is the time to harvest, dress, and grade the grains or the grapes, whatever's coming out of the ground. And this has to be done within a very tight window because you don't want to wait too long because then the frost is going to come kill, but you don't want to do it too early because you're not going to get as much productivity at it, right? You need to know how to time this right. And it all had to be done relatively quickly. So this was another very harried part of the year. And then the winter comes, and once again, there's another slow period in which less is done around the farm. Traditional manufacturing. The definition of manufacturing is to make by hand, right? Hand, factor, to make. And so even in this word we use today for industrial production is rooted a prejudice towards artisanal work, where there is a single person who is going to take a raw material and turn it into a useful product. That could be a blacksmith who takes iron and then makes horseshoes or nails, any of the utensils we have, so spoons. It could be a cobbler who takes leather and turns it into shoes. All of these were done by hand, and generally speaking, in most of these artisanal workshops, someone did all of the activities one fell swoop all the way through, right? They didn't divide up the labor. The division of labor is an idea that comes out with Adam Smith, or Adam Smith recognizes it and talks about the benefits of having people specialize in different parts of a product. That was considered a novel idea. He emphasized this because in everyday life, this was not being done. In most instances, the people worked all the way through a product. There were some areas of mechanization. This goes all the way, the flour mills go all the way back to Roman times. The Romans understood how to harvest the wind and or harness the wind and harness the water to create a mill that would grind grain, so you don't have to do it by hand or have a horse do it. This was very beneficial, but once that flour was produced, then it still had to be manipulated by hand, right? Somebody had to make the bread, someone had to bake the bread. It was done by a baker, and that baker was a skilled artisan. There were no machines. The stirring, the kneading, all of that was done with his or her own hands. The Dutch did have some advancements in sawmills. The Dutch understood how to harness the wind, and so they were able to take logs and wood and cut multiple boards out of the same log at the same time. Instead of having somebody or two people with a handsaw trying to trim out the boards, right, one at a time, going, getting smaller and smaller, the Dutch were able to figure out how to put various saw blades parallel to each other, get them to work in parallel, and then run a board through. But then once the board was done, in order to make that into something, in particular what they were interested with ships, all of the shipbuilding was done by hand, right? You have people with hammers and nails and hand saws and get it all to fit together. And that was an artisanal project. That was not done by machine. One of the innovations that does come in the 18th century is the putting out system, or the cottage industry. Since the Middle Ages, most industrial production was controlled by guilds, skilled craftsmen who would join together in confederations. So you had a miller's guild, or a jeweler's guild, or a baker's guild, or a butcher's guild, right? All of them, right? A particular type of trade bonded together to regulate the quality, price, and production levels of a particular good, because they were interested in keeping their livelihood up. They were recognized by the government that they could organize their guild. In the 17th and 18th century, capitalists started using the cottage industry. they started finding that downtime for particularly young ladies who weren't working in the field at any particular moment, that could spin, for example, woolen thread. And so the merchant in the cottage industry would go to a shepherd and be able to buy wool in bulk, bring it to a young lady and have her spin it into wool, take that and pay her by piecemeal, by how many yards she does. So it doesn't matter how long she spends, she's not getting paid by the hour, she's being paid by piece. Take that, bring it to someone else and have them weave it. That weaving was done in a home. The person who did the weaving owned their own hand loom, and then took it to somebody else and sold it as finished cloth, right? That's called the cottage industry or putting out system, right? All of the various pieces of getting a cotton cloth are separated into peasant cottages. The person who did this was able to make a profit because, number one, they're not following guild regulations. And since they're doing it in the countryside, their production is not governed by guild regulations or guild control. They're taking advantage of downtime in peasant labor. And they're also taking advantage of the fact that peasants more and more in the 1700s and 1800s need cash in order to pay rent, to buy clothes, to buy better food. And so they can get cheap labor. And if anything goes wrong, right, if the spinning wheel breaks, it's on the peasant girl to replace. If the loom breaks, it's on the peasant to replace. It's not the person who is engaged in this. So this does draw in capital into production. But it's a merchant who is sort of guiding or organizing this place over various cottages, right? It's not in a single workshop. It's done in homes spread out across multiple homes. At the end of the 19th century, or excuse me, the end of the 18th century, laissez-faire becomes a catchword. More and more industrialists, manufacturers, capitalists push for fewer government regulations in the economy. But we have to be careful when we talk about laissez-faire, because what these men, and it's primarily men, were after was the dissolving of guilds. These merchants, these capitalists who had excess money, they wanted to put it to work, didn't want to follow the rules of the guilds. So at the beginning of the 19th century, they started pushing for an unregulated labor market. So for example, the La Chapelle Law of 1791 in France, or the Combination Laws in 1799, 1800, and 1825 in England. Both of these laws reduced the ability and hindered the ability of manufacturers, people who made by hand, artisans and laborers, to combine or come together to protect their product. What this favored then was it favored capitalists. People had capital. They were able to hire labor cheaply and then sell cheaper products for their own personal gain. right? They weren't worried about the standard of living of the worker. They weren't worried about the quality of the product. They were interested in making sure that their personal wealth increased regardless of whom it hurt in the community. So they were able to convince the French government, the English government, to free capital, right? That limited restrictions on capital, but at the same time, these laws put regulations and obstacles in the way of organizing labor. They did this with some of the arguments based that, well, if workers are able to combine, if workers are able to unionize, then they're probably going to be conspiratorial and they're going to get together and try to overthrow the government like they did in the French Revolution. Or they're going to get together and put only look out for themselves. So these arguments in favor of laissez-faire were arguments in favor of getting the government out of the regulation of capital, right, investments, but putting regulations on the ability of workers to organize and try to protect the fruits of their own labor. This has an impact going forward in the 19th century, because almost for the first half of the 19th century, laborers who started working in factories had no protections in the workplace, safety protections, wage protections, job security protections. They had no protections at the beginning of the 19th century when they made this shift from a home economy to a factory economy.